In this video, I will show you what I consider to be the facts that completely refute biblical creationism. It should be noted, however, that the evidence I bring to light will most likely have no effect on the faith an individual has in biblical creation. And while shaking faith would certainly be a positive change, my primary goal is not to do so. My main goal is to at least show that the beliefs of Christian creationism can only be based on blind faith, and that science and simple observations stand in firm opposition to those beliefs. So, without further ado, let's begin. My first points of scientific evidence are what I think to be the most convincing arguments against creation I have ever heard. The first one goes a little something like this. Imagine Noah's Ark. It's filled with a pair of every single animal kind that has ever existed, and 7 pairs of clean animals. There are also 8 people comprising Noah's family. Now, anyone who took high school biology will know what alleles are. They are the different possible forms of a gene, and each person can have a maximum of 2 alleles for each gene. 1 allele from mom, and 1 allele from dad. However, in the greater population, there may be many more than 2 possible alleles for a gene. For example, each person can only have 2 alleles for blood type, but there are, in total, 3 different alleles that determine blood type. In the case of Noah and his family, each person must have 2 alleles for each of their genes. This means that there can only be a maximum of 16 different alleles for any one gene. In reality, though, most of the 8 members of Noah's family would share alleles because of being related to one another, but this would lower the number to less than 16. For our situation, we will give the creationists the best possible odds. Now then, this knowledge of Noah's family's alleles may not seem like much, but when we factor in other commonly held creationist beliefs such as information cannot be added to the genome, and most mutations are harmful, what we have is a recipe for disaster. This means that in all of Noah's descendants, in other words, all of mankind, in any population, there can only ever be a maximum of 16 different alleles for any given gene. And so, the vital question is, are there populations today that have more than 16 different alleles for a single gene? The answer is a resounding yes. In fact, there are locations on the genome where there are more than 540 different alleles, all coding for the same gene. Given this evidence, some part of the creationist worldview has to give. They can decide which part. My second piece of evidence, having thought of it myself, is not nearly as clever as my first, but it is just as big a roadblock to creationism. Allow me to explain. All over the Earth there are sites where asteroids have impacted the Earth. These are called impact craters. While most meteors heading towards Earth are small enough to be completely burned up in the atmosphere, there are a few asteroids per millions of years which hit Earth with any noticeable effect. It wasn't hard to go on Wikipedia and find the 43 largest discovered impact craters, each measuring at least a minimum of 20 kilometers in diameter. These impact craters were dated from as far back as 2 billion years ago to as recent as 5 million years ago. But the most remarkable aspect of the largest 3 craters is their sheer size. The diameters of the largest 3 confirmed impact craters are 300 kilometers, 250 kilometers, and 170 kilometers. Scientists estimate that an impact crater 300 kilometers wide would require an object 10 kilometers wide traveling at 30 kilometers a second to hit the Earth, and that the impact would instantly vaporize 70 cubic kilometers of rock. In addition to flinging massive pieces of Earth's crust into space, most of the debris would fall back to Earth and coat most of its surface, superheating it and causing massive destruction in the form of forest fires and atmospheric clouding. Such an impact would kill most of the life on, in, or above the crust. Not to mention that this did not just happen once, but 3 times, with similarly sized objects. It sure is a good thing that impacts like the 3 I mentioned and the other 40 largest impacts happened before humans existed. But what creationists would have you believe is that these events happened within the last 4,300 years after the flood, and that somehow humans and animals didn't notice. For these massive impact craters to exist in a post-flood world, real meteors would have had to hit the Earth, with devastating consequences for all life. For my third piece of evidence, I will resurrect my personal favorite old creationist saying, there are no transitional fossils. This has to be one of the most overused, inaccurate phrases ever uttered, and is commonly used by creationists in an attempt to attack evolution. This old saying came about back in Charles Darwin's time, when transitional fossils were few and far between. 150 years later, however, the transitional forms of numerous organisms have been discovered, and they now serve as an excellent demonstration of the physical evidence for evolution. To name a few, scientists have discovered the transitional forms between tetrapod animals and whales, between dinosaurs and birds, between apes and humans, between invertebrates and fish, from fish to tetrapods, from amphibians to reptiles, lizards to snakes, and from lizard-like creatures called synapsids to mammals. Not only do scientists have these transitional fossils, but they also have clear understandings of the evolutionary histories of many animals and their body types, such as bony fish, spiders, insects, snakes, turtles, birds, lizards, and many more. Of the transitional fossils previously mentioned, probably the most convincing and obvious transition is that of dinosaurs to birds. Most creationists watching will probably be expecting me to bring up Archaeopteryx, but I won't, simply because although it is an excellent transitional sample, there are better samples from the dinosaur to bird fossil line. Let's take a look at a few creatures. This first one is named Sinosauropteryx, and shows very clearly a dinosaur with distinct feathering along its back and all the way down its tail. Note that this fossil has teeth instead of a beak, arms instead of wings, and displays the morphology of a theropod dinosaur, but, like I mentioned before, has feathers. Next, let's take a look at Sinornithosaurus, where again we see feathers and teeth, but a slightly more bird-like anatomy. However, the separation of the bones in the arms and hands along with several other morphological clues clearly identify this creature as neither solely bird nor solely dinosaur. For my last example, called Bapiosaurus, the only pictures of the fossil I could find are pictures depicting the neck and tail portions of the dinosaur covered in feathers. Other fuzz-like feathers covering other parts of its body were also found. As is clear by the picture, this animal had teeth in non-bird-like morphology, but also had feathers. It is worth mentioning that I don't have the time to bring up every fossil specimen that depicts transition. I will, however, put a link to my sources in the info box so you can check all of them out for yourselves without even having to search for them. For my fourth piece of evidence, I will combine several arguments against the biblical account of a global flood. The first of these arguments is the following. Where did all the water that fueled the flood come from? And for that matter, where did it go? For water to completely cover the surface of the earth, there would have to be roughly 3 times the amount of water on Earth. Even if all the water was taken from the atmosphere, and then even more water somehow came from the ground through the fountains of the great deep, water escaping from Earth's surface quick enough to raise the water level to 29,000 feet in 40 days would not only cause massive destruction to the crust of the Earth where it burst forth, but the speed at which it escaped the crust would be hundreds, if not thousands of miles per hour. This would create unbelievable turbulence in the global water level, and potentially cause millions of cubic miles of water to rain back down onto the Earth, causing great destruction. The immediate effect of such an event would be massive tsunamis that would circle the globe and quickly annihilate the Ark and its inhabitants. Then, after the 40 days were up, all that water had to go somewhere. If that much water had evaporated, our atmosphere would be hundreds of times thicker than it is now. It could not have gone back into the ground either, as there is no evidence for this, and no known mechanism by which millions of cubic miles of water can re-enter the Earth's crust. Secondly, even if the Ark didn't sink while the entire Earth was flooded, the sudden influx of fresh water causing a massive dilution of salt water on Earth would have certainly killed all saltwater sea life. The appearance of these creatures today is testament to the fact that either the flood never happened, or Noah was somehow able to create enough fish tanks out of gopher wood and pitch to house every species of saltwater organism that has ever lived. And now that I've mentioned it, for my third point, many creationists claim that while Noah only had to take animals in groups of classification similar to the modern scientific organization of order or class, those few animals can now account for the entire genetic diversity seen throughout all of nature. However, to propose this is to wholeheartedly embrace some sort of hyper-evolution within the span of 4,300 years, that even the most dishonestly committed evolutionary biologists would dismiss as madness. To clarify this point, consider my first point of evidence about Noah's family. I showed that even if Noah's family survived the flood, the sheer weight of genetics restricts them from generating the genetic diversity required to yield the current variety in genetic material among humans today. As it turns out, the same principle works even more effectively for every animal species that has ever existed. Take for example the cheetah. Scientists today understand that roughly 10,000 years ago, the population of African cheetahs bottlenecked. This produced an existing population of roughly 20,000 cheetahs in the wild. Because there were so few cheetahs, the genetic variability shared among them was narrowed to the point that in modern times, cheetahs are so genetically similar that one cheetah can accept skin grafts from almost any other cheetah, regardless of location. This is significant because in humans, we can only accept skin grafts from our siblings or close relatives, and even then, the odds are slim. To put it in plainer terms, the entire genetic variability of the cheetah species has less genetic variability than one single human family. As a result, cheetahs suffer from low fertility, increased birth defects, an astronomically high infant mortality rate, and a helplessly low resistance to disease. Now, consider these conditions, but stemming not from 20,000 individuals, but from a single pair. While considering that, imagine that you don't have 10,000 years to aid genetic variability, but less than half that time. This desperate situation completely hits the fan once you consider the creationist claims mentioned earlier about genetic mutations being harmful and not being able to add information to the genome. If we take the biblical account of a global flood literally, we should expect to observe cripplingly low genetic diversity in every species alive today. That is, even if any species could survive with such low genetic variability.